So this next chapter is the endocrine response, and this gets into the into our continued conversation from looking at the energy systems. We were looking at the glycolytic system, the oxidative system, and really exercise intensity is what drove energy systems. And when we start looking at this, and this chapter is not in your textbook, this is a chapter from the Essentials of Strength and Conditioning. But I extracted this chapter and I posted it on Blackboard. So if you go through if you try to look through your Essentials of Personal Training, you won't find this textbook chapter anywhere. So it's in the Blackboard shell, and it is discussed a little bit in your chapter 5 of your Essentials of Personal Training and Adaptation. But this whole module gets into the bioenergetics, gets into adaptation and endocrine response, which we all pull together in terms of what exercise intensity you're in and what your energy system you're in, and what energy system you're in determines what hormonal environment. And if you're trying to create an environment that is favorable to lean body mass and unfavorable to fat, this is what's going to be the best information with you for yourself, or more importantly for your client. So you want to create an environment that's going to be catabolic to body fat and anabolic to lean body mass. And we have sex differences between men and women that change which hormone is better for who. And then we look at exercise intensity as that driving factor. And then next module or next unit, we'll get in when we get into nutrition, we'll talk about the recovery aspect. So right now we're looking at more the stimulus, the stress response. And the field of endocrinology is huge. I mean, there's like a whole division, it's a whole system within the human body. But we're looking specifically at hormones that are favorable to resistance training, resistance exercise. And when we look at the endocrine system, it is the glands of the body that secrete hormones, and we got used to the nervous system as using a chemical form of communication. So you go from electrical impulse to neurotransmitter to electrical impulse, and then the same thing for the muscle. The neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, is a chemical messenger that transfers through the synaptic gap, so it's covering some space and then propagating a signal around. Well, the hormonal system is similar to that, but instead of being from nerve to nerve or tissue to tissue, you have a stored area of the gland. You have the body that is observing its homeostasis, and homeostasis is the body's ability to maintain physiological balance. And if something challenges that, aka a stress, and that could be a physical, emotional, psychological, the body then responds to, because something's out of balance. The nervous system, the brain here, has been monitoring that, and then depending upon what that is, it will stimulate the thyroid gland, the pituitary, the adrenals, the liver, the pancreas, kidneys, the testes or ovaries, depending upon sex, and it releases a hormone. And then there's that message is like a text message being sent from the brain, recognizes something's going on, it broadcasts that message, and then the tissues are they respond in kind. And so you have these feedback loops where you have a constant state of this goal of trying to maintain homeostasis or balance, and the body is monitoring that and then releasing hormones for that. And so the hormones are the chemical messengers. They're released from the endocrine glands, and like I said, there's pages upon pages of hormones. And this is such a crazy field because, like, you have renal doctors that focus on kidneys, and you have cardiovascular doctors that focus on the heart. And there's a hormone that they call vasopressin, an antidiuretic hormone, that is the same freaking hormone. But the heart research, cardiovascular research, have been looking at it from a very isolated view, and the renal doctors looking at it from it, but they didn't realize it was coming from the same spot and ended up being the same hormone, just different. They were looking at it from different aspects. So there's a lot within the hormonal system that is still undiscovered, particularly that a single hormone by itself doesn't really do much. It's a synergy that needs to happen. So it's not just the body's expecting growth hormone, it's expecting growth hormone, insulin-like growth factors, and glucagon. And cortisol is usually in the presence of testosterone. Will have a different response if cortisol is in the presence of insulin. And so you have these synergies that play on each other. So what happens is when people take hormone supplementary, whether they're taking anabolic steroids for performance, or they're taking hormone replacement, or like aka things like birth control, things can get out of loop quite a bit because you're giving just one hormone and the body's expecting a symphony or spectrum of hormones that are there. You have two types of hormones, primary. You have protein-based hormones, and you have fat or steroid-based hormones. And what really gets into the effect there, I don't know if there's a good image here. And these are receptors. I don't know if it gets into the, yep. So you have these, when you look at the cell, you have the cell membrane here that's a phospholipid layer. And what it does is it prevents water or water soluble things from getting through it. What it does allow is it allows fat soluble, because this is a fat layer on the outside. So when you have these steroid-based hormones, which are based on cholesterol, so these are your sex hormones and your cortisol, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and then you have your peptide or protein-based hormones, and you can have single amino acid ones, which are like your epinephrine or ephedrine, and then you have your like shorter chain protein hormones like your insulin and glucagon, and then you have like your long chain amino acid hormones, which are like growth hormone, which are like 190 amino acids long. They all act the same way. Protein-based ones, lipid-based, or I'm sorry, peptide-based are water soluble, and then the fat or the cholesterol steroid-based ones are fat soluble. And the way that hormones work is that they don't, like, just because your testicles release testosterone or your adrenals release cortisol, it doesn't affect all the tissues of the body. The way this works is the way the signal works is like, let's say you had a message that you're broadcasting on, let's say, Instagram, and only your followers would receive that message. And so your people would have to subscribe to you or follow you in order to receive that message itself. Or let's say you wanted to send a group text, which I freaking hate group text because everyone starts responding and you start getting, your phone gets blown up. But even like a group text, you specify which people want to receive that message. And if you're talking shit about someone, you're going to exclude that person from that conversation. So the way that the cells work, they work in a similar aspect, is that the message is broadcast globally. I send that text message out, or that adrenal gland, or that testicle, or that pituitary gland, it sends the message. All of this is distributed via the circulatory system. And as you guys learned from last unit, the circulatory system distributes through the entire body. You can't really control you can control the rate of blood flow, but you can't prevent blood from going from an area. You can slow it down or speed it up by dilating or constricting the blood vessels, but the blood's going to get there. So the way that the body corrects for this is that it globally broadcasts the hormone, but then what it ends up doing is that certain receptors that are on the cells, they're either in tune with that hormone or out of tune. So if there's a particular receptor, so if you're seeing here in the image is you have a particular hormone that's in circulation, it will only affect cells that have the matching receptor for that. So particularly lock and key, this is the key, this is the lock. And so if the hormone B comes around and it doesn't have a receptor on that cell, it's going to go right on by. That message is going to be lost. So when you're getting the message from growth hormone to increase metabolism, to increase tissue synthesis, it's going to affect muscle tissue, it's going to affect bone and collagen and connective tissue, but it's not going to affect your heart or your skeleton. It might affect your skeleton a little bit. So it's going to have its effect on certain tissues. And why this is important for us is that we have hormones like insulin that are extremely anabolic to, let's say, lean body mass, but they're also extremely anabolic to fat tissue. And so that wouldn't be a hormone that you want to maximize. And sometimes you can't control the hormone itself, right? So when you look at the hormonal effect, it's not just the amount of hormone that's circulating, it's also your sensitivity or the number of receptors that are there. You can have high blood levels of a particular hormone, but have very low receptor activity, and you're not going to get that hormonal effect. And that's what happens, especially with like diabetes, is that your body has no problem producing insulin. You're actually producing lots of it. That's why eventually the pancreas burns out, because you're producing too much insulin. Those cells are working overtime. The reason is that not because you have high insulin in the blood, because the receptors on the cells that are the recipient of that message from that hormone, the message is falling on deaf ears. It can't do its job because you have a burnout of the receptors. And this is how the body kind of controls these feedback loops, is that if it has a too much hormone, it will downregulate its receptors so it doesn't have as much as effect. And the body does this to protect itself. You know, if you look at if you really look at the human body, we could, when you look at like disorders of the hormonal systems or receptor systems, humans do have the potential to be 7, 8, 9 feet tall and be 3, 4, 5, 6, 700, 800 pounds of muscle. So the He-Man action figure from the 1980s could be a realistic body type if the body didn't, if the receptors were unchecked. It's not from lack of hormone, it's from lack of bioregulation from the hormonal system. And what you're seeing a lot in the sports performance world are these SARMs or these peptides or these proteins, these different compounds that you can take that don't necessarily increase your natural testosterone levels like steroids do, but what they're doing is they're working on the receptor activity making these receptors more effective. And that's where a lot of the research is going with exercise, is not how do we have a bigger hormonal response, but what can we do to maximize receptor activity. So that's where the science and the physiology is, and it's not just, like I said, the hormone. Like if you look 20 years ago, it was the hormones themselves. Like even more than that, like 1980s, that was the big steroids, taking supplemental male hormones, and then 1990s, 2000 growth hormone kind of became the thing, and then pro hormones and pre hormones, making sure that you had the right chemicals to do that, and now it's into the receptor activity. So you're kind of seeing the industry trying to pander to where the science is leading, but it all comes back to the same thing: is that you have a imbalance, right? Some kind of stress that threw you out of homeostasis. The body's trying to respond to that. Now that stress could be either because of the environment, because you got sick or burn or fall or mental stress, cut off in traffic, or it can be self-induced, aka exercise or diets or strenuous activity, and you are trying to maximize a response so that the body adapts and gets stronger. And so this adaptation process that we're trying to elicit through exercise is 100% driven by the hormonal environment. And that hormonal environment is 100% driven by the levels of stress you're being exposed to, aka the intensities. And so exercise manipulation or program design or the workouts that you're doing are nothing more than manipulation of physiological or in your environment to elicit specific endocrine or hormonal responses. And so understanding how the hormones work at a perspicatory level, but more importantly, understanding how do you manipulate those anabolic and catabolic states that maximize lean body mass and minimize or maximize the decrease of body fat or fat tissue. So anyways, that's the hormone. Protein hormones, they have to interact on the surface, whereas steroid-based hormones, they can actually, so here's your luteinizing hormones coming from the pituitary gland. It's telling the testicles to release testosterone. Testosterone's released in the blood. It can easily transfer through the phospholipid membrane because it's a fat-based, right? So it has no problem going through this membrane. It doesn't need a surface receptor. Once inside the cell, it's eventually going to end up in the nucleus. And if you recall from, like if you look at basic biology, all animal tissues are made up of cells. And the basic cell structure is a cell membrane, a circle wall with a nucleus in there. And inside the nucleus is where you have your DNA, which is your blueprint for the tissues of the body. And what you're trying to do, particularly with testosterone, is, remember, if we look at like why muscles grow because they have more protein filaments inside of them. And they get bigger and larger, not so much the number of cells that change, but the cells themselves just swell and get bigger. So think of like balloons, and each cell, the number of cells doesn't change that much, or at least that's the thought process. And what ends up happening is those cells go from like small balloons to larger balloons, but instead of being filled up with air, they're being packed with proteins. Well, protein is synthesized in the DNA of the cell through the nucleus, and so you have you need something that triggers that nucleus to say, hey, we need to start kicking out more protein. It uses amino acids that you're getting from your diet, and then it's basically taking those building blocks. Think about the 22 or 21 building blocks that you're getting, and it's creating proteins. In this case, actin, myosin, titin, anything that's involved in the cross-bridge cycle that's going to pack that cell. That's driven by the nucleus of the muscle cell, and it's triggered by testosterone and other hormones as well. But that's kind of the point of the hormone itself, is to tell the cell to start kicking out new proteins, and those proteins then accumulate in the tissue that makes us stronger or bigger or faster and more allows more tension generation at the end of the result there. So that's kind of how that works. Now, the peptide-based hormones work differently. They do the same thing, but instead of having a cell transcription aspect, they're more working on the surface of the cell. Like for instance, insulin comes around, it connects with the surface of the cell, and it opens up another channel so that glucose can come from the from circulation and actually be absorbed or into the cell. So that's how you store fat. That's how you store fat and how you get sugar from the blood into the muscle tissue. And if that insulin's not working, your cells start to starve, and you start with this appetite increase. And even though you're well fed, your body is set. So there's a whole cascade. We'll talk about that in the subsequent units. But for right now, it's just understanding that there's a lock and key, that hormone effect isn't just about the amount of hormone. It's also about the receptor sensitivity, the number of receptors that are there, and that you have fat-based hormones that can transfer through the cell wall, which are based on cholesterol. And then you have protein-based, which are based on amino acids. They have to interact with the cell surface there. And that's really it. I mean, that's the most simplified version of endocrinology that I can provide. Um, but like I said, it really is complex. Like you got all these chemical pathways, which it's good to know, but it's way outside the scope of what you're going to be doing with your clients or understanding. So, and you can read through the mechanisms of, but this is kind of dry reading material. The way that I have the lecture set up is it kind of goes through like the hormonal, the mechanism of interactions, and it's more of this receptor lock and key theory. Where we're going to spend most of our time is understanding the primary anabolic hormones, and most importantly, how do you optimize or maximize the response from that. We'll also talk about the catabolic hormones. Now, just be aware that most people want to assume that anabolic hormones are good and catabolic hormones are bad. Anabolic is the buildup of tissue, and catabolic is the breakdown of tissue. But you got to put them in within context. Anabolic hormones are good if you're talking about tissues that you want to maintain or increase, so like muscle tissue, bone, and connective tissue. They might be bad when you're talking about fat mass or adipose tissue or adipocytes. So if something's anabolic to fat, that's not something you necessarily want to maximize. Catabolic tissues, that are catabolic hormones, things that break down tissue, we usually refer them as things within lean body mass. Like the breakdown of muscle is usually not good, but the breakdown of fat is probably really good. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to maximize hormones that are anabolic to lean body mass and catabolic to fat tissue, and you want to minimize or at least manage the opposite, tissues that are catabolic to muscle tissue and anabolic to fat tissue. Some hormones, like I mentioned earlier, insulin, are anabolic to both. So that's not something you want to maximize or minimize. That's something you want to optimize. And so you're going to be looking at maximization, minimization, and optimization. And I just again maximize hormones that are lean body mass favorable, fat mass unfavorable. Minimize hormones that are the opposite, and optimize. They have a perfect balance between ones that are either both anabolic or catabolic to both. And the ones that are anabolic and catabolic to both are usually related to the nutritional components, so glucagon and insulin. And we'll talk about that in the next unit when we look at nutrition and when you consume carbohydrate or consume protein or fat and how the hormonal response you get from that. But as you would expect, testosterone is the granddaddy of anabolic hormones. It's present in both men and women, although its presence in women is so insignificant. It's like 1/25th of that in men. And testosterone is what is the primary differential between men and women, and not gender, but sex. In terms of your sex, gender is more your social construct, where sex is your biological. Are you an XX chromosome or XY chromosome? And there are significant differences that testosterone provides. Now, the antithesis to testosterone is in terms of the female sex hormone, is estrogen and progesterone. But don't think for a minute that women have more estrogen and men have more testosterone. Men have significantly more testosterone than women, and men have as much estrogen as they do testosterone. So that's kind of a shock to a lot of people, is that you actually have a 1-to-1 ratio of testosterone and estrogen. So if you have a really high testosterone level, you also have a really high estrogen level, right? So it's not like testosterone level and estrogen levels in men, and when you look at women, it's testosterone and estrogen. It's testosterone and estrogen for men, and then testosterone and estrogen and progesterone for women. So women do have more estrogen, but men tend to have just as much or more than women. So the primary with women is progesterone, and that's where you get like this progesterone estrogen imbalance. And it's a very complicated topic, but it's something to think about, particularly if you have a female athlete who is very competitive and also taking birth control that's estrogen based. And it doesn't even have to be an athlete, any client that's trying to deal with like weight loss or fat loss. You start throwing off the hormonal balance with birth control pills, you're introducing huge amounts of estrogen that normally wouldn't be there, and you're throwing off that progesterone estrogen imbalances. So people tend to forget about progesterone when we look at the female sex hormone, but in terms of a fitness aspect, we want to maximize testosterone, both for men and women. Even if a woman is trying to maximize her testosterone level, it's very hard for her to do that. And when you look at some of these videos of these female bodybuilders, they are supplementing with male hormones. For a female, their most anabolic hormone is going to be growth hormone, which we'll talk about in a moment. So this optimization of testosterone is usually focused on men, or someone that is supplementing with testosterone itself. So we're in an age where you have female to male transition, and what's really interesting with these athletes or these clients is that they are basically introducing male hormone and they're getting their puberty phase. Although a lot of the cells have already differentiated, you can see the effect that testosterone has on the starting quantity of lean body mass, and so that's why women are usually about 60% as strong as men. That's looking, and on average, they're about 75%, 25% weaker when it comes to lower body, and like 40 or 50% weaker when it comes to upper body, because that's where the androgens have more of their effect in the lean body masses in the shoulder girdle area. But what will happen is when you introduce the testosterone, you'll start to get this rapid accumulation of muscle tissue. And so it's the muscle tissue that, you'll look at like body composition differences between men and women. And it's not so much that women tend to be fatter, because when we look at body composition in men, it's usually, let's say a competitive athlete, it's about 5 or 6%. And for that same competitor or that same level of competition for a female would be like 12 to 15%. So almost double or triple what the male is. And it's not that the woman has 3 times as much body fat, it's because the man has twice or 3 times as much lean body mass, right? So that's what creates that differential. But we'll talk about not in actually this chapter, but in the following chapter, we have adaptations, and we look at adaptation differentials between younger athletes, mature adults, and old athletes. And then you have your differences between. Hold on one second. I'm going to pause. Okay, so we're back at it. Sorry for that interruption there. I don't know. I forgot where I was. My train of thought was with the hormone development, but testosterone has this huge impact on lean body mass, and it doesn't necessarily make that. When you look at when we look at the lecture about adaptations between men and women, we'll see that women have as much potential for growth when you look at relative strength. So when you look at the amount of improvement that women have versus men, it's almost comparable. So testosterone doesn't really play a role in the progression. It just has a role in the starting point and the absolute strength. So about 90% of men are stronger than women, and about 90% of women are weaker than men. That's because of the testosterone, but it doesn't mean that women can improve or men can degrade. But especially when you look at some numbers, when you look at like sprint performance and world record, that you look at the world record for women's sprint, there's quite a bit of men that can easily match that, right? And it's just the differential between the amount of lean body mass was there. And this is 100% driven by the presence or absence of testosterone. Where this comes into play in practical aspect is you'll have female clients that are concerned with accumulating too much lean body mass. And it's always entertaining because we look at like teenage boys who have the highest testosterone they're ever going to have. Like testosterone peaks at the age of like 21, 25, and that realm, and then it slowly declines. And even though it declines, it doesn't decline rapidly, not like menopause where your hormones levels drop. But you have men that are, in this case, boys are in the gym that are working out, that are hitting biceps and chest every single freaking day, and they're trying to grow. And you have a female athlete who has 1/25th the potential growth capacity. And let's say they're on the high end of the spectrum. So let's say they have like 1/10 the growth capacity, right? That's like extremely high. They think they're going to grow like weeds, and it's just not going to happen because testosterone's not there. So women will get stronger, and this is where you get more into the myofibril hypertrophy. So you get more density in the muscle fiber without actually growing or expanding, and you still get strength gains, but you didn't necessarily do that by taking up more space. And so that's, again, the testosterone. Testosterone is interesting because it's one of these things that people think it's the total number of testosterone level in your blood, but it's also the amount of receptors that are there. And what turns on, so receptors turn on, turn off, is intense exercise. And so you always have testosterone floating around your blood, right? If you're sedentary and you take a blood draw as a male, you're going to have testosterone. Even as a female, you're going to have a little bit. It comes from the adrenal cortex, not the ovaries. But in terms of men, you have a certain amount of testosterone floating around the blood. Why isn't that you're growing rapidly, right? And what ends up happening is that it's the exercise that turns on those receptors to make your body sensitive to the testosterone. And it's high intensity training that elicits both a growth hormone and a testosterone response. And so that high intensity is what triggers those receptors. So and it's only the muscles that we're working. So if you do like a heavy leg day, the receptors for those muscles that we're doing legs, those will turn on and they'll be sensitive to testosterone. So not only are you getting a testosterone boost, but the tissues that we're going through the glycolytic system that we're using their sugar, they're probably going to also turn on the receptors and they're going to have the benefits from testosterone. So like one of the secrets that you would do is if, let's say, let's say you do a high intensity training day, and let's say you're doing legs, and so you've increased the receptor activity of your leg muscles, and you have increasing circulation of testosterone in the blood. If it was me, I would do like a set of arm curls to failure. I do a set of triceps to failure. I would just do one set to failure, just really easy set, not a lot of volume, just to kind of beat up the muscles to maybe turn on those receptors to kind of be a benefit of that testosterone. So it's almost like you're doing a full body workout, but you're minimizing the volume. And again, it's just understanding this play between not just the hormone in the blood, but are the receptors sensitive to that message, right? Are these receptors turned on and that testosterone's coming through and, oh yeah, I'll receive your message, and oh yeah, I'll start the transcription process, start producing protein. But if those muscles weren't used in a heavy way, that testosterone just kind of floats on by and doesn't do its thing. So the next anabolic hormone is growth hormone, and this is the most anabolic hormone to that's also let's not take that back. Testosterone is the most anabolic to muscle, where insulin is the most anabolic to muscle, meaning that it's going to facilitate the most growth, but it also is the most anabolic to fat tissue. So it's one of those hormones that you want to optimize and not necessarily be the dominant force in the body. Growth hormone is the interesting beast because testosterone only has a direct effect on lean body mass. It only affects this like increase in protein storage. What's interesting about growth hormone is that it's anabolic to muscle tissue, where it kind of supports the the amino acid accumulation, but it's also highly catabolic to fat tissue. It's primarily there to break down fat that's stored in the adipocytes and the adipose tissue and make that available for metabolic production for ketones or for metabolism. So growth hormone is one of those hormones that is like our granddaddy of looking good naked, because it makes you grow muscle or preserve muscle, and it makes you incinerate body fat. So it's one of those hormones you want to maximize. And it's as simple in terms of releasing a growth hormone of participating in high intensity activity, like high intensity activity, not just like orange zone type stuff, but like red zone type activity where like full on sprints as fast as you can. Or this is where CrossFit has really kind of opened the door. So the reason why CrossFit's so effective is because it's maximizing growth hormone response. Now, the problem with growth hormone is that it is usually followed by cortisol. And I have and cortisol is the exact opposite of testosterone. Cortisol it breaks down muscle tissue. It also breaks down fat, but it's doing the same thing growth hormone is that it's trying to make sure there's enough substrate available for the body so it can produce energy. And if you were to graph this out, which let me pull up the presentation here and I can show you the image that I have for it. I just realized I have to create a new graph. So if you look here, yeah, if you look here, you can see the hormones that are released, and this is looking at the exercise period of a high intensity aspect, and then it takes you out like 1 or 2 days to kind of show the cyclic effect and the long term. So you have an acute response to hormones, and then you have a chronic or long term type aspect. And if you remember when we talked about exercise, exercise is this one step back, 2 steps forward. So you're imposing a stress, something that your body's not used to doing. You're draining resources, and you're creating a harsh environment, something the body's not comfortable with, something the body's not accustomed with. And then part of the progression, or that needs to happen, is you need to take 2 steps forward. So you need to allow the recovery. So you have the The stimulus, recovery, stimulus, recovery, one step back, two steps forward, one step back, two steps forward. So you're making forward progress, but you have to balance stimulus with recovery, stimulus with recovery. Hormones kind of do that. That's what's happening is you're trying to stimulate a hormonal environment, then you're sitting back, allowing the protein synthesis to occur, allow the accumulation of tissues, and now you are recovered, you're back to baseline, and then some. And then you impose exercise stress again, and then one step back, you recuperate, and then some. And so you look here at the slide, and you'll see you have testosterone, which it does increase a little bit over the initial, but really what happens is testosterone really peaks in that after the 1 or 2 day of that delayed onset muscle soreness, everything's cleared, you start to get that increased testosterone response. And you'll see that growth hormone kind of has a cyclic period as well, and so does cortisol. And again, these hormones, cortisol, growth hormone, are there to make sure there's enough energy in your energy system. So you're spending time in the oxidative state, and let's say you have low carbohydrate intake or you're equally rested, your body needs to make sure there's enough substrate for ATP production for your metabolism, which is about 70-80% of your resting metabolic rate is just you existing, right? And so that's what these hormones are doing, even more so during exercise. It gets a high stress, high energy output environment. So what happens is you have cortisol released onset of exercise, and you see growth hormone also releases, and you can see that there's a different trajectory. Can I zoom in? Oh yeah, perfect, good. Okay, so right here you can see that cortisol kind of has like this slow, steady aspect, and then it peaks, and then growth hormone has this really rapid increase, and then it drops down. And if you look down here, you can see that it's about 20 to 30 minutes that you get this peak. If you could perfectly time your exercise sessions, and this is when you want to maximize fat loss, right? Preserving lean body mass, and you want to optimize fat loss. This is not just exercise. This is high intensity exercise that by the time you hit 20, 25 minutes, you are spent, you're done. And this is not 20 minutes in the gym where you get there, including your warm up and this is how much time you're spent in your high intensity phase. So you get to the gym, you're there 5, 10 minutes, 12 minutes, you do your warm up, then you start your high intensity stuff like your sprints or your CrossFit type workout. And if you look at most CrossFit type stuff, if they're done and designed really well, it should take you no more than 30 minutes to complete. And if you see here, that's right about the time that you're peaking here. I would think this graph, I just found this graph because I didn't have to create it, but if you were to graph this out, this would actually be more here. It kind of peaks in the first 15, 20 minutes. And cortisol is more exponential, where they have the similar aspect. They're trying to make sure there's enough substrate there. So sugar, amino acids, and fat. The difference between growth hormone and cortisol is growth hormone is an amino acid sparing. So it actually prevents breakdown of lean body mass, because it's the way that tissues work. This is how fat and muscle works, is that you can either be storing or you're releasing. You can't do both. So if you're in the buildup phase, you're not losing any amino acids. But if you're in the breakdown phase, you are, but you're not gaining any. So if you have a message that's going through the body that's saying break down muscle tissue, that means that there's no protein synthesis. That means amino acids are being converted to sugar and then converted to fat. Same thing happens with fat. If your body is in a fat storage mode because insulin levels are elevated, you are not burning any body fat. Everything that's coming in is in storage mode, storage. And so you want to manipulate these environments where you're in an anabolic storage for protein and a breakdown or departure or whatever for fat tissue. And this is what growth hormone does, is it preserves or increases lean body mass and breaks down fat. So what ends up happening is after that 20 or 30 minute mark, so at the very first onset of stress, the body's first response is growth hormone, and cortisol starts to ramp up here. And you can see that cortisol takes over after about 60 minutes. So when you're 45 to 60 minutes into your workout, growth hormone drops and cortisol increases. So if you could perfectly time your workouts where you end here and like right here, you prevent cortisol from kind of being the dominant hormone, and growth hormone's able to do its thing. And that's what happens when people work out for too hard or too long. They start to you're not maximizing your gains. And so again, if fat loss is the goal, you'd be doing these 20, 30 minute workouts, get in, get out, and done, right? And then there's a whole nutritional strategy that follows with like insulin from nutrition, carbohydrate intake, which is a whole nother story. But now you're asking, well, what about I'm in the gym for 60, 90 minutes at a time. What am I doing? And what you're doing is you're breaking down tissue. And hopefully what ends up happening, remember what I said about receptor sensitivity, is that sometimes it's not just the hormone levels that are there, it's also your receptors to it. And if you're a sedentary individual and you perform a high intensity aspect, your body's not expecting to maintain that lean body mass. So cortisol will come out and it will make sure there's energy available for ATP production, and it's going to break down fat, which sounds like a good thing. It's also going to break down muscle tissue. But if you expose yourself to enough bouts of exercise, one of the adaptations for your lean body mass, your muscle tissue, is that it down regulates your cortisol receptors, so that the cortisol still has an effect on fat tissue, but it has a minimal or diminished effect on your lean body mass. So cortisol that's done in an acute environment, if you've done any kind of research, you'll see that cortisol is considered the stress hormone, and that it's the primary reason why we, besides insulin, why we get like our stress-related fat distribution. So that's like abdominal body fat and the flabby arms and the man boobs and the beer belly, the guts, the saddlebags, and it's related to insulin, but it's more related to the cortisol from the stress. So we kind of look at cortisol as like a bad hormone, but it's a good thing because it's allowing the anti-inflammatory type environment. It's allowing the tissues to repair, but it's got to be one of those hormones that's optimized, where if it's done in the acute environment where you stressing your body out during exercise, which you're trying to do, you want to maximize your growth hormone, minimize cortisol, but cortisol still, you can't not have cortisol released. But what you're trying to do is give yourself little doses of it so that your body becomes basically immune to the effects on the lean body mass. And you are one of these hormones that you're optimizing, and it should only be released in smaller doses when you are in a stress environment. So sympathetic hormonal, parasympathetic nervous, I'm sorry, the sympathetic nervous system. And then that's why it's really important to maximize that parasympathetic recovery so that you're suppressing that cortisol. So the rest, the relaxation, the breathing, the mental anguish, a lot of the cortisol is from lack of sleep, artificially control. It's from sympathetic response. So whatever you're doing to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, like we talked about a couple units ago, it's cortisol is the response that is coming out from that. And so if you can get out of the sympathetic state in the parasympathetic state, you're cortisol. But when this comes back to exercise, is that you get a lot of people that are working out 60, 90 minutes at a time. And these are long periods of time that you are imposing stress on the body. And you would probably benefit more from doing more frequent sessions. So instead of doing a training day and conditioning afterwards, so you get a lot of people that are like 30 to 45 minutes of training and then 30 to 45 minutes of conditioning afterwards. You're best off breaking it up into 2 separate days. Like I would rather see 3 days of training and 2 days of conditioning, and then break that up and give yourself more of this time in this growth hormone aspect. So those are different strategies that you can manipulate. If fat loss is your goal, you'd be doing these shorter intensities to maximize growth hormone. If muscle growth and performance is your goal, you would probably do these longer exercises, but don't expect fat loss as rapidly as you could if you're maximizing that growth hormone. So again, it's not one's better than the other. It's just what are the needs and the goals of your client, and that's how you start to manipulate your your exercise environments. I just learned that you can scroll in on a presentation. That's pretty cool. Oops. You know what? I'm just go back to this why I had it up. So you can see growth hormone kind of, if I can find it real quick. So I couldn't find the slide, but here I got an image here. So one of the interesting things with growth hormone, and this was growth hormone when it was kind of discovered in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was growth hormone is a big issue with like dwarfism and gietism, and people that suffer from dwarfism have issues with the pituitary gland. We're not producing enough growth hormone, and then people that are giants they have an overproduction of pituitary stimulation, and they have too much growth hormone. And so, if you have too much, you're going to be too big, and if you have too little, you're going to be too little. And they haven't perfected the like insulin's perfected, because the insulin that they give is almost a perfect analog to the human insulin, but the growth hormone itself is not quite the exact same peptide or protein length that they need, because it's a long protein. It's about 190 amino acids long. And what they noticed was that when they would look at growth hormone in younger people, so not only did it have to do with like stature and size and weight and everything, but if you look at younger people under the age of 20, you can see growth hormone levels are really, really high. And as we get older, you can see growth hormone levels peter out. And this line is a best fit curve. It's looking at the average. But one of the interesting things is if you look here, that you can see some people that are in their mid 60s that have higher growth hormone levels than their younger 20s. And what I want to figure out about this is that growth hormone is really prevalent in your younger developmental years, right? Which would make sense. This is when you're getting tissue differentiation. This is when you're rapidly growing in length. You hit puberty. You're going from 5'1" to 6 foot. You're going from 100 pounds to 200 pounds. Right? These are just arbitrary numbers, but you do see some of these rapid growth. Like I think of my high school journey when I started freshman year, I was 152 pound in the wrestling weight class. And by my senior year, I was 205. So in 4 years, I gained almost 50 pounds, and this was mostly lean body mass. So, I mean, you don't see that type of growth later on in life. So when you're younger, you're going to see this rapid accumulation. But growth hormone, as I said, is really important to the maintenance of lean body mass. The reason why it was looked at as the fountain of youth is that most of your skin, like wrinkles and nail quality and joint breakdown, arthritis, and your inability to move is really related to the amount of collagen that you have. And growth hormone is intimately tied with collagen production. And so that's why it's usually referred to as a youthful aspect. And what they thought was, hey, great, we can just inject growth hormone and we would have this, we would be able to have this longevity. Well, it was a big flop. It didn't work out. And I think part of the reason is because the hormone itself isn't a perfect analog. The other aspect is that, remember what I said earlier, is that hormones need, you need a symphony of these hormones together. So you can't just give one and expect a response. If you have growth hormone naturally, it's usually coming with like 4 or 5, maybe dozens of other hormones and some other pro-hormones and other compounds that are just outside of our view right now. So in and itself isn't a good thing, but you can naturally increase hormone productions. And like I said, the number one reason for growth hormone output is your participation in high intensity exercise. And not just, hey, I lifted weights, but like I sprinted as fast as I can for 30 seconds. How many 40-year-olds are doing that? How many 50-year-olds are doing that? How many they're not, right? So when you look here in your early 20s or late teens, you're usually participating in sport. And so you are regularly doing these high intensity aspect, right? When you're a kid, I look at my son, he'll sprint the entire block, right? He'll just run and keep on running. I'll sprint for little short distance at a time because I'm trying to recuperate, maximize my recuperation. And then I don't know any of my colleagues they're in their 40s that are sprinting, right? They're all exercising. I went for a jog, I went for a bike ride, I lifted weights, maybe the most 6 reps, but when's the last time that you fell on the floor because you collapsed from exhaustion, right? That's the type of activity that gets growth hormone responding. That's what keeps you young. It's that short bout of that high intensity exposure to growth hormone and then stop and recover. Don't let it go in from a growth hormone dominant activity to a cortisol. So again, it comes back to what I was saying weeks ago, where that sympathetic versus parasympathetic balance is that you need those little exposures to that sympathetic environment and then out. And that little exposure and out. Parasympathetic, the recovery, the rest and recovery should be your most exposed, and then you're supplementing with these little bits of high intensity activity to get this growth hormone output. So just an interesting perspective on looking at the rates of decline with growth hormone. And again, no matter where you look, the graph is pretty significant where you get this rapid drop, and then here, but you'll find these outliers always out here. And again, it's probably related to who's participating in high intensity activity and who's not. These are your sedentary individuals here. These are your really active individuals there. These are your active individuals there and sedentary individuals there. So after puberty, you should expect almost a horizontal growth hormone line, but you shouldn't have to decline anymore, right? And again, it's not that you're preventing wrinkles. You're just going to push it out as long as possible, right? And again, the metabolic benefits from it, from the fat and the fat burning and the muscle gain. The last anabolic hormone are these insulin-like growth factors, and these are related to the growth hormone and somewhat insulin production. But IGFs are kind of still unknown a little bit. There's quite a bit of them. There's dozens of different IGFs, and The reason is that they're coming from the liver, and they're more of this like positive feedback loop with growth hormone. But this is probably one of the reasons why growth hormone doesn't work by itself, that you have growth hormone and you should have a equal response from the insulin-like growth factors. They say insulin-like growth factors, they're not necessarily insulin because they're not coming from the pancreas. So that's where insulin comes from. But insulin is the other anabolic hormone, and it is one of those hormones that is anabolic across the board. It's anabolic to both muscle tissue and fat tissue, and this is one that's usually controlled by diet. I'll just talk about it now since we've talked about it a little bit, but we'll go into a lot more detail next unit. The way insulin is manipulated is through diet, through food, and more importantly through macronutrient choice. So how much carbohydrate, how much protein, how much fat. Insulin is macronutrient dependent, and it is mostly a product of carbohydrate intake, but it's also a pretty big factor in protein intake as well. So people think that they go on a low carb diet, they usually replace it with a high protein diet. And one of the benefits of a low carb diet isn't the fact that you are getting rid of carbohydrates. The main benefit of a low carbohydrate diet is that you are keeping insulin levels low because you're not getting these insulin spikes, and you are somewhat creating a hypoglycemic where you can eventually get into ketosis. But if insulin levels are elevated, you can't do that. And so when you're eating lots of carbohydrate and you're eating a lot of protein, particularly if you're eating a lot of low fat protein, which is what a lot of people do, you're getting equal insulin responses. And dairy protein tends to be the biggest protein that people go to when they go low carb. So they do like cheese tortillas, or they'll do cheese pizza with no crust, or they'll do extra cheese. And dairy proteins are very insulin producing, like extremely insulin producing, because they produce these insulin-like growth factors. And protein is meant, especially dairy, is meant to rapidly put on weight for a developing toddler or feed a child, so that they can rapidly, not even child, but your infants or toddlers, so they can rapidly gain weight. And so it's a very insulin producing food mechanism. And the value in dairy, if you're going to consume it, is really in the fat, not in the protein itself. And not that the proteins, and I love cheese, and not that the protein's bad, it's that it's insulin producing. And insulin becomes our number one culprit when we're trying to maximize our fat loss, or we're trying to maximize our inflammation environment. So like I said, we'll talk more about this in the following units, but protein increases insulin. And the only macronutrient that is insulin neutral is fat. So your body doesn't care if insulin is a response to like total caloric intake. So if you eat a really high fat meal, you're probably gonna get an insulin response. But if you're eating like low fat, higher fat, lower protein meals, you're probably gonna get very little of an insulin response. And if you eat carbohydrate, you're definitely gonna get an insulin response. Whether you're gonna get it right away or over time, your blood sugar levels are going to elevate at some point. And that's the primary goal for insulin, is to remove sugar from the bloodstream so that it can drop its sugar levels low. And then it stores it in the liver first. Remember, only about 100 grams, so 400 calories. Whatever's left over goes to the muscles, so about 1,500 calories. And then anything left over is converted to body fat and stored as fat. That's it. Sugar has no other, carbohydrate sugar has no other function in the body except for fuel, right? Protein has its increase in insulin response because it usually releases its antithesis hormone, which is glucagon. And so insulin is elevated to kind of to battle glucagon. And then fat's the only one that doesn't really have your body doesn't care if your triglyceride levels are 100 or 400. It doesn't have an effect. But sugar levels, if they go from 100 to 400, that's a life or death situation. So those are the three primary anabolic hormones: testosterone, growth hormone, insulin. Insulin, you're trying to maximize or optimize for both sexes. Testosterone is going to be maximized for men. It's naturally going to be high regardless. It's going to cycle through. So your goal with testosterone is making sure you're not impairing it with like a lack of sleep, or not sleeping, or it's being sick or stress. And it's also more sensitive to receptor turn on and off. So you're trying to manipulate more receptors. And growth hormone is 100% driven by intensity. And also you're trying not to step in the way. As we get into our last unit, we'll talk about how lifestyle factors like going to bed past midnight and not protecting 10 to 5. Yes, meaning being asleep by 10 o'clock and not waking up from 10 to 5 to maximize your growth hormone output, right? And there's some relationship between melatonin and how much light you're being exposed to at night. And So there's, again, all these interplays that are there, and we're trying to pick the ones that are more related to fitness and lifestyle, so your wellness and coaching aspect. Your catabolic hormones we talked about are going to be cortisol and your catecholamines, your adrenals. And again, the big takeaway from this is what we've kind of talked about is the sympathetic versus parasympathetic. These are important aspects acutely in a short period of time, but they should never be your chronic long-term play. So these hormones are great short-term sympathetic response and then right away parasympathetic recovery. And it comes back to the one step back, two steps forward, one step back, two steps forward, making sure that you're emphasizing recovery as much you are stimulus. And I think just for being length of time, that kind of ends us right here. I think that's it. So again, a lot of information, a lot of practical application. Again, this is not in your textbook. This is in the chapter 4 of the Essentials of Strength and Conditioning, which I have on the Blackboard shelf for you. I just have this chapter 4. Any questions? I think